Okay.
Meine Damen und Herren, Ladies and Gentlemen, heartfelt welcome, herzlich willkommen in die schwedische Botschaft. Wir haben heute ein spannendes Programm, ein erstes Programm, aber without further ado, das war mal heute ein bisschen Verkehr in Berlin, we had some traffic. I want to give the floor to our ambassador, Her Excellency Veronica Vand Danielsson.
Thank you, Katarina, and wow. Despite heavy traffic, impressed to see that so many this late hour a day could make it and are participating in this important discussion we will have this evening. Herzlich willkommen och hjärtligt välkomna till våra svenska gäster. Jag sa just, jag är lite som jag har bott länge. You see already what languages do I use? English, Swedish, German. The good thing is I've spent a long time in Brussels, so you quite often are in the situation where you jump from one language to the other. But I will do my Grußwort auf Deutsch. Wir sind in Berlin, Nordische Botschaft in Berlin im Felleshaus, für unsere deutsche Gäste natürlich. Und dann werden Sie, glaube ich, das Seminar wird auf Englisch moderiert. Meine Damen und Herren, kära damer och herrar, liebe Gäste und liebe Online-Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer. Ich begrüße Sie zu dem zweiten Teil unserer könnte sagen, Miniserie zur Geschichte der weißen Busse. Letzte Woche, am Tag der Befreiung Dänemarks von der deutschen Besetzung, haben wir dem Ende des Zweiten Weltkriegs gedacht, Erinnerungskultur in Deutschland und Nordeuropa diskutiert und den Dokumentationsfilm Befreiung aus dem KZ, die weißen Busse von 1945 von Tilman Büns gezeigt. Dieser zeigt die Spurensuche der Tochter eines dänischen Juden, die von den weißen Bussen aus Theresienstadt gerettet wurde. Leider mussten wir letzte Woche auch von dem Tod der Holocaust-Überlebenden Leuchtfigur gegen das Vergessen und für das Miteinander und für die Menschlichkeit, Margot Friedländer, erfahren. Sie war eine der prominenten Zeitzeuginnen. Ihr Appell "Seid Menschen" wird hoffentlich auch zukünftigen Generationen ein wichtiger Aufruf sein. Stimmen wie Margot Friedländers werden immer weniger. Damit ihre Geschichten uns erhalten bleiben, braucht es auch Menschen wie Monika Hartwig Ericson, Überlebende in zweiter Generation, die ich hiermit heute Abend herzlich begrüße. Warmt willkommen, Monika. Meine Damen und Herren, meine Damen und Herren, für Schweden ist die Erinnerung an den Zweiten Weltkrieg von einem besonderen Spannungsverhältnis geprägt. Die schwedische Bevölkerung war nicht direkt von Kriegsgeschehen betroffen. Unsere Städte blieben verschont. Unsere Bevölkerung konnte weitgehend in Sicherheit leben. Eine Lebensmittelrationierung wurde zwar eingeführt, aber ansonsten waren die Schweden nicht besonders betroffen vom Krieg. Das hat viele Jahrzehnte das Selbstbild von Schweden geprägt. Das neutrale Land im hohen Norden, neutral zwischen Ost und West, ein humanitärer Leuchtturm mit einer großzügigen Entwicklungshilfe. Spätestens mit unserer EU-Mitgliedschaft 1995, ja, dieses Jahr, vor genau 30 Jahren, hat Schweden die klassische Neutralitätspolitik hinter sich gelassen. Und mit unserer Mitgliedschaft in der NATO, dieses Jahr vor genau einem Jahr nur, hat auch Schweden ihre Zeitenwende vollzogen. Aber zurück zu der Kriegsgeschichte. Das Bild des Zweiten Weltkrieges in Schweden ist auch unumstößlich mit den Namen Raoul Wallenberg und Folke Bernadotte verbunden. Das Handeln des schwedischen Diplomaten Raoul Wallenbergs während des Zweiten Weltkriegs ist einzigartig. sein Mut, sein Handeln, seine unermüdliche Arbeitsfähigkeit sorgten für die Rettung Zehntausender Jüdinnen und Juden vor dem Holocaust. Der Mann, der so viele gerettet hat, aber selbst nicht gerettet werden konnte und dessen Schicksal immer noch in geheimen russischen Archiven verborgen ist, wird für uns immer ein Vorbild für Zivilcourage und Humanität sein. Und die Hilfsaktion der weißen Busse, organisiert von Graf Greve Volker Bernadotte, dem Cousin des Königs Gustav VI. Adolf, und er war stellvertretende Vorsitzender des schwedischen Roten Kreuzes, rettete das Leben von über 15.000, hauptsächlich norwegische und dänischen Häftlingen. Aus dem KZ Ravensbrück, dem Frauenkonzentrationslager, nicht so weit von hier entfernt, wurden auch viele Häftlinge anderer Nationalitäten gerettet. Es ist mir daher eine besondere Ehre, die Leiterin der Gedenkstätte Ravensbrück, Frau Dr. Andrea Genest, zusammen mit Dozentin Ingrid Lomfors, ehemalige Direktorin des Forums für lebendige Geschichte, und auch Dr. Britta Geschwindt vom Schwedischen Holocaust-Museum heute Abend bei uns auch online begrüßen zu dürfen, um die verschiedenen Perspektiven auf die Rettungsaktionen zu erforschen. Heldensgeschichte wie die der weißen Busse und Raoul Wallenberg haben einen wichtigen Platz in unserem kollektiven Gedächtnis. Sie sollen uns alle inspirieren, Verantwortung zu übernehmen, aber auch aus unserer gemeinsamen Geschichte zu lernen. Die Rettungsaktion der weißen Busse ist für mich auch ein persönliches Anliegen. Oft während meiner Kindheit hörte ich meine schwedische Großmutter wie auch meine eigene Mutter von den weißen Bussen erzählen. Sie hatten den Krieg in Nürnberg überlebt, wo mein Großvater schwedischer Konsul war. Dank der weißen Busse konnten sie sich zurück nach Schweden retten. Meine Mutter war damals nur 15 Jahre alt. Die schlimme Fahrt, die Kriegszeit natürlich, aber auch die schlimme Fahrt durch das kriegszerstörte Deutschland hat sie nie mehr vergessen. Aber auch nicht ihre unendliche Dankbarkeit für die Rettung durch die weißen Busse. Heute, in einer Zeit, in der Krieg nach Europa zurückkehrt und Menschen aus der Ukraine erneut auf der Flucht sind vor Gewalt und vor Zerstörung, ist die Erinnerung an die Vergangenheit und die Lehren, die wir daraus ziehen können, wichtiger denn je. Es ist ein Auftrag an unsere Demokratien und an unsere Menschlichkeit, nicht wegzuschauen. Ich möchte mich an dieser Stelle deshalb besonders bei dem Schwedischen Holocaust-Museum und dem Forum für lebendige Geschichte bedanken. Ohne ihre Anstrengungen und ohne diese Zusammenarbeit würde dieser Abend nicht stattfinden können. Varmt tack. Ich wünsche Ihnen jetzt alle einen erkenntnisreichen Abend. Dankeschön fürs Zuhören.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Vangeland Danielsson. Good evening. My name is Katarina Szécsi Åsbrink. I am head of the Department for Communication and Promotion here at the Swedish Embassy, and I will be your guide through the night. We have now changed to English, and as you will hear, we are going to take part of an introduction of the story, the rescue operation of the white buses, which will be followed by a panel discussion. And after this panel discussion, you're also kindly invited upstairs to grab some Ukrainian food and drinks. And you will also be able to, another way, view the wonderful exhibition, or the part of the exhibition that we exhibited outside of the photos from the arrival in Sweden of the white buses. But in order to start, in the work Voices from the Abyss for choir and cello 2023 by the Swedish composer Staffan Storm, he interpreted texts by women who survived the concentration camp in Ravensbrück and came to Sweden with the white buses. These texts are derived from the so-called Ravensbrück archive, which is called Witnessing Genocide, which consists of a unique material of interviews, in-depth interviews with these survivals, and also actually of poetry written by the women in Ravensbrück. We're going to start this program by listening to a small part of Staffan Scott's composition with a poem by the Polish prisoner Zofia Iwanicka. She calls it Return, and the student in Malmö, Kajsa Lemark, she has turned this music into a video. And Kajsa, she comments her own work, which you are about to see, in the following way. This film portrays the longing for death when life is no longer life. The peace of the women in this video is in the smoke, in the death, and the longing for the end. The names that roll are from the arrival lists of the women rescued from Ravensbrück by the white buses, and symbolize all the women in Ravensbrück who lived during a time when they saw death as their salvation. Please, the video. of Sofia Ivanitska. So, what was this rescue operation that go under the name the White Buses? I'm very honored and very welcome to greet Ingrid Lomfors, Associate Professor at the Göteborg University and also the former head of the Living History Forum, which is, can we tell for our viewers here also tonight, a public agency that was founded 25 years ago that works on democracy and equality between all people, inspired using the lesson from the Holocaust. Ingrid is now going to give you an overview of what this rescue operation was about. Please, Ingrid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katarina, and thanks a lot for the invitation. It's nice to see you all here. So, as Katarina said, I will give you a brief overview of the Swedish rescue operation in Germany in 1945, which in the post-war memory have become known as the White Buses or sometimes as the Bernadette Expedition. What I would like to mention is how it all started, how it was carried out, the result of the operation, and a few words on how it has been remembered in public memory after the war. And I'm aware that this is a challenge to cover all this in 13 minutes without being superficial, but I will still give it a try. So let me start by telling you something about the historical context and the circumstances. In 1944, in late 1944, it became clear that the war was coming to an end and that Nazi Germany appeared to be the loser. And in Scandinavia, discussions had been held for quite a long time how the Scandinavian prisoners in various German camps could be saved. And these prisoners, numbering around 8,000 people, individuals, were mainly young Norwegian men and women from the resistance movement in Norway, as well as Danish police officers who had been captured and deported to Germany. Now I just remember that I have to, So this is a photo of the Danish police officers being imprisoned in Buchenwald in January 1944. So the proposal, the sharp proposal to send Swedish aid to Germany was a Norwegian initiative. As you know, Norway was under German occupation and it couldn't act itself. And Sweden, however, remained neutral throughout the war. So the pressure was really on Sweden to act and to help its neighbors. So eventually, in February 1945, the Swedish Foreign Minister, Christian Günther, decided to carry out a secret Swedish rescue operation. And the mission went to Count Folke Bernadotte, who, besides being a member of the royal family, was the vice chairman of the Swedish Red Cross. So he was sent to Berlin to negotiate with Himmler. And the Swedish embassy, this embassy, but it was in a different location, under the leadership of Ambassador Arvid Rickert, was instrumental in brokering this connection. Here you see Folke Bernadotte, and you also see a telegram from Ambassador Rickert to Sweden. He tells us that Himmler had given his consent to gather all Scandinavian prisoners who at the time were held in around 20 different camps all over Germany in one camp, which would later turn out to be Neuengamme, right outside of Hamburg in northern Germany. It's also clear from this telegram that Bernadotte received Himmler's consent to bring Swedish-born women home, who were, as Veronica mentioned before, living in Germany, being married to German husbands, and some were soldiers, some were missing, and perhaps even confirmed dead, some of them. So, and they had children, and now they wanted to return to Sweden. Now, it was very important to all to keep this operation secret, because Hitler was still alive, and he would never accept a release of prisoners. Himmler, on the other hand, was interested in a separate peace and was hoping for Bernadotte and Sweden to facilitate, perhaps even arrange for a peace deal. To carry out such a large and risky aid operation, a huge number of vehicles and men were required. And who could provide all necessary equipment, including personnel? Only the Swedish armed forces. And this connection to the armed forces had to be covered also for the Allies, since it was out of the question to send military vehicles to Germany in the middle of a raging war. So the green military vehicles therefore had to be converted to civilian vehicles by painting them white and putting a Red Cross logotype on them. A few words about the implementation. A total of 250 Swedes participated in this rescue operation, and the vast majority of them were young soldiers who had volunteered for the mission, and with some extra payment, of course. Almost 100 vehicles were used for the operation, including motorbikes, ambulances, cars, trucks filled with food and medicine, etc. And here we see pictures getting ready for departure on March the 8th. The huge expedition set off via Denmark and then south across Germany. They carried with them lists of the Scandinavian prisoners, as well as names and locations of the different camps in which they were imprisoned. The expedition set up camp in Frederiksro Castle, just outside of Hamburg. The lady of the castle was born in Sweden and a friend of Bernadotte, that's why. And during the month of March, the Bernadotte expedition managed to collect and bring almost all the Scandinavian prisoners to Neuengamme. And in the meantime, negotiations were underway with Himmler in the hope of obtaining permission to transport them to Sweden. That was the hope, of course. Yeah, here you see a map. This is a map from the Red Cross, and you see how they travel. Let me see where I have here. Yeah. So in the beginning of April, Himmler agreed to release these Scandinavian prisoners altogether so they could actually be transported directly to Sweden via Denmark. At the same time, Himmler gave permission to release 132 Scandinavian female prisoners in Ravensbrück, also transport them directly to Sweden. He had already approved the transport of around 1,500 Swedish women and their children directly to Sweden. So as you can imagine, the buses were constantly on the move. Now, the closer we get to a collapse of Nazi Germany, the more chaotic the situation becomes. And some concentration camps were abandoned by the Germans, which opened up new possibilities, of course, to save more prisoners. But it also became much more urgent because the sanitary conditions and the health conditions were a disaster and the access to food almost non-existent. Suddenly, in mid-April, the Danish Red Cross is allowed to enter Germany, which is a huge thing. And it really helped out, made a huge impact. So in a joint effort between the two countries, 423 Danish Jews were saved from Theresienstadt. And it's the first time that Jewish prisoners are being helped by the white buses. Now, in terms of Jewish prisoners, one should have in mind that the Jewish organizations, especially World Jewish Congress, for a long time had pressed the Swedish government and also Bernadotte to do something for the Jews in general, not only the Scandinavian Jews. And when that didn't happen fast enough, they decided to see if they could get access to Himmler themselves, and they managed. On April the 16th, Norbert Masur, the World Jewish Congress representative in Sweden, was granted access to Himmler. It was a unique meeting. Can you imagine a Jew negotiating with Himmler? And the person who prepared and arranged for this meeting to take place was Himmler's private masseur, Felix Kersten. Kersten helped Himmler relieve his back pain. He suffered from severe back pain, and therefore had the opportunity to persuade him to release more Jews. And this may sound as an anecdote, right? But these circumstances were crucial to the outcome for the Jews to be saved. Oh, sorry. Just remember. Then things happened very fast. In mid-April, Bernadotte's mission was more or less completed. All Scandinavians were in safety. Suddenly then, in April 19th, Bernadotte, received a message from his uncle, Prince Carl, the chairman of the Red Cross in Sweden, telling Bernadotte, see, I'm a little behind, I think. I'm missing a picture, I think. Yeah. Okay, never mind. We lost the picture. To pick up prisoners of other nationalities as well. And 2 days later, Bernadotte met with Himmler once more and managed to get his permission to bring the white buses to Ravensbrück in order to release civilians of other nationalities. A few days later, a column of Danish ambulances under Swedish command departed from Fredriksro to Ravensbrück. It was able to pick up almost 3,000 women, French, Polish, Belgian, and Dutch, about half of them Jewish. Let's see if I can find a picture of that. Yeah, here they are. And you can tell that their health was very poor, much worse than the majority of the Scandinavian prisoners. And soon thereafter, there were 2 more rescue operations, one with the buses that saved around 1,000 women, and one with the train, the so-called ghost train, going from Ravensbrück to Denmark. So, and as we are getting close to the end of the war, Hitler takes his own life, as we know, and a week later after that, on May the 8th, Germany had surrendered on all fronts. By then, the entire Swedish relief column was back in Sweden. Now, a few words about the results. The mission was completed, and it was a success. The Scandinavian prisoners were saved and free. Around 15,000 people were rescued by the white buses. 8,000 of them were Scandinavians, the rest of other nationalities. The Norwegians and Danes were able to return home. It was harder and sometimes even impossible for the others. They suffered from bad health conditions, and a majority, especially the Jews, they had no homes to return to. So how was the rescue operation being perceived? Well, it aroused appreciation and respect in Sweden and in other parts of the world as well. One should keep in mind that during the war, Sweden received severe criticism, mainly from the US, for its extensive trading with Nazi Germany, especially when it came to iron ore. So the rescue operation improved the reputation and international standing of Sweden in the eyes of the Americans. The rescue operation also improved the status of Sweden among its Nordic countries, of course, and it contributed enormously to the post-war Nordic cooperation and construction and identity. Upon his return, Bernadotte wrote a book about his own efforts with the title The End, My Humanitarian Negotiations in Germany and Its Political Consequences. There were many books written at that time in 1945, but his book became the foundation for the official narrative and the Swedish historiography of the rescue operation. Yeah. In the summer of 1945, when the war was over, the Swedish Red Cross was involved in an additional rescue operation. Right after the war, there were, as you know, a lot of people, about 250,000 people, survivors, mainly Jews, in DP camps all around Germany. And they were very, very sick, and they had nowhere to go. So at that time, around 10,000 former concentration camp prisoners and survivors were helped by boats from Lübeck to Sweden. The majority were Jewish women from Poland and Hungary. They were liberated from Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen, Oranienburg, and Sachsenhausen, but most of them had been to many, many camps before and even ghettos, so they suffered a lot. This post-war operation was a collaboration between UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the Swedish state, and the Swedish Red Cross. For many years, these 10,000 survivors were, intentionally or unintentionally, counted in Bernadotte's rescue operation. Only in recent years, researchers, as myself, have noticed the great difference between the white buses and the relief operation that took place in the summer of 1945 after the war. This operation has nowadays an official name, namely the White Boats. Finally, a few words about how the rescue operation has been remembered in the public memory. Bernadotte became a national hero, and he contributed a great deal to it himself by taking credit for the success, despite the fact that there were so many people that played an important role to make it happen. The Swedish Red Cross, for its part, has for many years mixed the number of those rescued with the white buses and those who came with the white boats, so that one got the impression that Bernadotte saved 30,000 prisoners from the concentration camps. That has now been officially corrected. Also, there is still a rather common perception that the rescue operation with the white buses was aimed at saving Jews during the Holocaust, and that Jewish survivors were the vast majority of those being brought to Sweden. This was never the case. However, in the national memory, this perception is common, and it still lives on. And here you can see two rather recent examples. These are photos that I have taken myself at the International High-Level Conference on the Holocaust in Malmö, Sweden, October 2021, with Jewish survivors, the Prime Minister, the Swedish King and Queen, and what, if not, a white bus. There's so much more to tell about this, and we will discuss some of it later, but this was my brief overview. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. Please have a seat. We will continue now in the form of a panel discussion with Ingrid to start with, and then also with other guests. So, Ingrid, thank you so much for this overview. And you did comment on the national memory of the white buses, and you did touch upon the perhaps a little bit inflated role of Count Bernadotte and a little bit of the overstated numbers of rescued prisoners. That was corrected. However, and also this misconception that this was an operation mainly targeted at rescuing prisoners that were Jewish. 20 years ago, you also published a book called Den blinda fläcken, The Blind Spot, where you actually discovered another dark side of the white buses. Can you tell us what happened on 27th, I think, to 29th of March, 1945?
Okay. So I told you before that the Scandinavians were gathered. I mean, they were in various camps, 20 camps all over Germany, and they had permission to be collected in Neuengamme, right? And when the first buses came with prisoners to Neuengamme, and the Swedish Red Cross, saw the conditions, the terrible conditions in Neuengamme at that time. I mean, you can imagine, we are talking about March 1945, the sanitary conditions were absolutely terrible. They said to themselves, is this right to bring these Scandinavians to a camp that might be even worse? The conditions are worse. So they brought this problem up with the commandant, Max Pauli, and said, listen, the conditions here are so bad, we are afraid to bring so many Scandinavians into Neuengamme, what shall we do? So the commandant Pauli came up with a suggestion. He said, well, I think we should empty one big block, and you can make better sanitary conditions there, and then you can bring the Scandinavians there until you are able to bring them to Sweden. And the Swedes said, that's a good idea, we'll do that. The thing is that the commander didn't have any vehicles. I mean, he didn't have any possibilities to deport them. But so the Swedes had to deport, and I'm using purposely the word deport because this was what it was all about. 2,000 ill French, Polish, and Russian prisoners to other satellite camps. So when I discovered that, I started to research in German and French archives because I wanted to see what happened to these people. What were the consequences? And the humanitarian consequences were a catastrophe because most of them died. So this was in order to give space, a safe space for the Scandinavians. And this is what my book is all about.
This is, of course, important and troubling information. And of course, it gives us a lot of follow-up questions, the impossible questions, of course, of trying to look at history and review the decision-making. Of course, one of the questions that will come up, well, could the Swedes have refused? Or somebody would argue, well, it would have jeopardized the entire operation. I guess the moral, philosophical question also comes up about, can we sacrifice some for saving others? Impossible questions, I know, but do you have any comments on that?
Well, first of all, it's a counterfactual question that you raised. I mean, it's impossible to know what would happen if they said no. What we do know is that they didn't come up with an alternative. I mean, they didn't say, let's bring them to Fredriksruh, where they are more safe, or let's bring them to Sweden. I don't know what would happen. And I don't think it's my role as an historian to raise philosophical questions. I mean, what I try to do is to look for facts and to be honest and to, as much as I can, look for the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. And that's my job. That's the job of the historian, I think. And others can, you know, be judgmental and philosophical, but that's not my job.
It was very interesting. We had in the first part of this mini-series on last week, this issue came up because also in this film that the ambassador mentioned in the beginning of Tilman Bunds, this is also mentioned about, so to say, the swap of prisoners. And it was very interesting also to see the German reactions. We had some German participants who were a little bit surprised of how critical we were of ourselves. So my question would be, are we too harsh in asking these questions? How was your book received?
Yeah, there was a debate, of course, in Sweden and in Norway and in Denmark, but I think it was a necessary debate. I mean, it's painful. You start to deconstruct a national hero and a national narrative, and I think it's necessary to not to look at these operation and other things in Sweden from a national Swedish perspective. I think it's very important to, you know, to include other source material because the Holocaust was not. It cannot be viewed as a national narrative. I mean, it's an international issue. So I think it's so important to include other source material. So are we too harsh, too critical? I don't think it's a question that can be raised to an historian. I mean, we're looking for truth, we're looking for facts. And it's very, very important to also to look at issues and aspects that has been forgotten and that might be unpleasant.
Thank you so much for these very insightful comments. And I would like us to continue now on our journey, because we know that the last transports of the white buses, they brought these mostly non-Scandinavian prisoners from Ravensbrück. And it's my great privilege now to welcome Dr. Andrea Genest. Please have a seat, Andrea. You are the head of the Ravensbrück National Site, and you are also the deputy director of the Foundation of Brandenburg Museums. A little more than a week ago, I and also other diplomats and a prominent crowd visited your workplace because of the 80 years commemoration of the liberation. And I have to say that we are extremely, of course, impressed by the work that Andrea and her colleagues are doing in terms of keeping the memory alive, but also educating primarily young people about the Holocaust. So can you give us a picture? Ravensbrück was all camps are different. Sometimes that surprises people. But could you just give us some facts, how the camp was founded, how it operated, and how many prisoners the camp had in Ravensbrück?
Thank you. And first of all, thank you, Ingrid, for this very important insight and this critical insight as well. Ravensbrück was unique because it was the central women's concentration camp in the German Reich. Perhaps it's not very known in Germany, and sometimes it's more known in France or in Poland, because the female elite of these countries were imprisoned or was imprisoned in Ravensbrück. And the German prisoners were in the minority in Ravensbrück. It was found in the eve of World War II in May 1939. The Second World War was not very far away. Germany was preparing the war. And the Lichtenburg, the first women's concentration camp, became too small, so they established Ravensbrück. First only for 3,000 prisoners, because we are women. And when they occupied more countries in Europe, more and more women from these countries, from the resistance movements, but also civil slave workers came to Ravensbrück. So altogether there were 120,000 women imprisoned in Ravensbrück. And the peak was in 1944, when about 40,000 prisoners were imprisoned in Ravensbrück, in the main camp, as well as in the satellite camp. And there were over 40 satellite camps as well, belonging to Ravensbrück.
Over 40 satellite camps and 120,000 prisoners. And Andrea, we also know that there were different prisoners in Ravensbrück. You had, as you mentioned, some Jewish prisoners, you had political prisoners, and you had different categories. I think we also have a table. Yes, this one I think originally from Dachau, but it's the same system, right? I mean, most of you may be familiar, of course, with the David Star that the Jews were forced to wear, but you can also see a whole plethora of different combinations, the different categories, homosexuals, so-called asocial women. Could you tell us a little bit about the categories of prisoners, and also if you can elaborate a little bit on the hierarchies of these prisoners, because they also had their experiences differed somewhat.
Yes, enormous. And Europe was very nationalistic in the 30s and the 40s. So there were a lot of pictures about the others with the people. So in the beginning, German prisoners came to Ravensbrück, Austrian prisoners, communists, social democrats, socialists, but as well so-called asocial prisoners, like perhaps prostitutes or women preparing an abortion, all these women who didn't fit into the German society and the National Socialistic Society. And when the war started, so Polish women came to Ravensbrück, French women, women from other occupied countries, and there were these differences inside the groups, the national groups, because some came from towns, some came from villages, they had very different backgrounds, and there were these pictures about each other from different countries. So the women were not used, or a lot of them were not used to travel, they were not used to other languages, to meet women from other countries. So for some of them, or for a lot of them, Ravensbrück was a place to learn something about Europe as well. And they remembered it a little bit about like this. These were the women who analyzed their stay in Ravensbrück. But of course, and you mentioned it, there was a big hierarchy within the camp, and the SS supported this hierarchy. And very low were the Jewish women and the so-called asocial women. Yeah.
We know that at the end of the rescue operation of the white buses, around 3,000 women were rescued from Ravensbrück, and we also heard about the ghost train that Ingrid mentioned, around 4,000 more women. But can you also tell us then at the end, when on 8th of May, when the war also was over, how many of these 120,000 prisoners in total actually survived the 8th of May, or perhaps they didn't survive the coming days? That was also very common. And actually, how many were murdered?
Yeah, it's difficult to say how many survived, because the time of liberation was a longer term. So it started in February when the first prisoners were released. The first came to Switzerland. Then around the 25th of April, the white buses started, and I think it was 7,400 women coming from and children coming from Ravensbrück to Sweden. At the 28th of April, the death marches started to the northwest of Germany with 20,000 women and children. And there were these 3,000 women and men staying in Ravensbrück, more dying than living. And what's your question?
How many actually survived?
I'm sorry. And we know there's a number about 28,000 women and men who died or were murdered in Ravensbrück.
28,000.
And we don't know who died on the way to the on the death march, for example, just after the war. We don't have the number.
one of the women that came with the white buses from Ravensbrück and to Sweden was Dina Honigman. I think we have a photo of Dina from 1946, beautiful woman already in Sweden at that time, and it's my great honor to introduce the daughter of Dina, Monica Hartwig Ericson. Can you please join us up here? Monica, we're extremely thankful and honored to have you here. You are what we call a second generation survivor. Your mother was Polish, Jewish origin, and she came to Ravensbrück. However, this was not the only camp that she survived, right? So can you just tell us briefly about where Dina had been before she actually arrived in Ravensbrück?
Yes. But first I would tell that I saw her name. That was on the film. When it started, the film and the music.
Yes.
Then suddenly I saw her name.
Yes.
I didn't know it was there. Well, she came to Ravensbrück at the end of the war in January 1945. After leaving Auschwitz-Birkenau in a death march. The prisoners had to leave Auschwitz just before the liberation and go out on death marches to different other camps in Germany. And my mother's group walked for 3 days. It was a very, very cold winter, and they were thin clothes and wooden shoes, and many died. That's why they're called death marches, of course. She had to walk for 3 days, about 50 kilometers, to a train, and in open cattle cars, they drove to Ravensbrück. But when they came to Ravensbrück, there was no room for them. They had to sleep outside the first night in the snow. She got very ill. But after recovering, slightly at least, she was sent to one of the sub-camps of Ravensbrück called Malchow. And in Malchow, she had to start working about the same kind of work that she had made in Auschwitz, ammunition production. She had to work in chambers under the ground with polluted air 12 hours a day in Malchow. So she had spent 2 years, just for the history, 2 years in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and before that, 2 years in another labor camp in Poznan called Antoniohof, where there was a very, very hard work with constructing railway tracks. There was no food or nothing. And to this place, she came from the ghetto in Lodz. She was born in Lodz. And in January 1940, her family were forced to move to the ghetto. In one room, they had to live parents and 7 children. While she was in Antoniohof, her family was transported to the first extermination camp in Poland, Kremno, where they were murdered. This she didn't find out until after the war, because she was not allowed to write or take any letters in this slave labor camp, Antoniohof. So that's her story backwards.
Thank you. So she had already gone through so many hells before coming to Ravensbrück. You also told her now that she had to work in the ammunition factory, which we know was also located close to the camps. And then on the 25th of April, she was rescued, I think, with the last white bus that actually left Ravensbrück. And Monica will now share her testimony of her mother, reading it out. So you will hear about Dina first standing on that yard to catch the last white bus and all the way to Sweden. Please, Monica.
My mother told me a lot, and all that wanted to listen to her. So I know a lot about her story, and this is what she told me about Ravensbrück and the liberation. And then she was in this Malchow, the sub
Camp. Yeah.
So, in the morning of April 25th, we noticed something unusual happening in front of the buildings in Malchow. White buses marked with red crosses had arrived and were parked in the yard. The drivers stepped out, holding lists of names in one hand and food packages in the other. And they began calling names. When a name was called, the prisoner received a food package and was invited onto the bus. But we soon realized that not a single Polish Jewish woman was being called. None of us received food or were invited aboard. When all the names had been called, we were left standing there, the bus crews on one side, and we, the skeleton-like, starving Polish Jewish women, on the other. Yet, strangely, they looked at us with compassion in their eyes, something we were not used to. Who were these people? Then, when all the bus seats were filled, something extraordinary happened. The drivers asked those already on board to make as much room as possible and told those of us who still had some strength left to climb aboard. I was the last to board my bus, and later I did learn that this was the last transport from Ravensbrück, and many prisoners were left behind. I did not know who these kind strangers were or where we were going. Part of me feared it was just another German trick, just a new place to kill us. But soon I was informed that we were going to Denmark. The journey north was very dramatic. The roads were packed with fleeing civilians, former prisoners, retreating German soldiers, and all kinds of vehicles. The chaos forced us in the buses to move, and the buses to move slowly. We were frequently attacked by low-flying Allied fighter planes. When they approached, the driver would stop the bus and wave the red flag from the Red Cross, often with no effect. Then we were asked to jump out and hide in ditches and behind bushes until the danger passed. And this happened several times. The first time it happened, the driver told us, "You may leave the bus, you are free now." I will never forget his words, "You are free now." Nor will I ever forget how the Red Cross staff shared their own food with us. We, the unlisted, unnamed passengers who hadn't received anything. It was the first act of kindness I had experienced in 5 years from someone who wasn't a fellow prisoner. At night we slept in fields and waited for daylight to travel further. One tragedy still haunts me. The bus behind ours was struck by a fighter plane and exploded. Some passengers were wounded, others killed. One of those who died had a sister in my bus. She was beyond consolation. Eventually, our convoy reached Denmark. Some Danes, trying to be welcoming, spoke to us in German, and we panicked. We didn't dare to get out of the bus. Perhaps, we feared, this was just another German trap after all. But when the Danes placed plates of sandwiches outside the buses and spoke to us gently, hunger overcame our fear, and we decided to risk stepping out. But we were no longer like ordinary people. We ate like savages, quickly and desperately. And when the Danes looked away, we stuffed as many sandwiches as we could inside the broken lining of our coats. Who knew when there would be food again? That night we slept on straw beds in a village church. We were told to keep quiet. The war wasn't over, and German soldiers were still in Denmark. On April 28th, we arrived in Malmö by boat. It was on that boat I truly understood I was free and wouldn't starve anymore. I went up on deck and tossed my sandwiches, now covered with lice, to the seagulls.
Ladies
This is
and
the story of my
gentlemen,
mother.
Monica Hartwig Ericson. Thank you so much for sharing your mother's memories and her testimonies. And I would like also to go back and mention what I said in the beginning, that Dina Honigman was one of those rescued people on the long list that you saw in the video. But we do have this collection, this unique collection of testimonies from concentration camp survivors in the so-called Ravensbrück archives, because it turns out that there was a group, it was called the Polish Research Institute in Lund, who conducted in-depth interview very soon after arrival of these prisoners to Sweden in order to document their testimonies and also to document war crimes. And this material has now been digitalized and it's accessible to anybody. Everybody can read it, and recently it also was declared by UNESCO as a memory of the world. And we would like to show you a short example of this fantastic resource, which you all can access and see this treasure chest, I would say, of testimonies that were documented already in 1945-46. And you can see here that you have all the different categories that we already talked about, the different prisoners categories. And then you can actually click on there. It's very user-friendly. And you can go to a specific witness by, for example, here we have a Polish, I think, political press prisoners. And you would also have the translation, because everything has been translated to English, so it's also accessible as a fantastic resource. And I urge all of you with more interest in this to take part. And here we can see that this Polish woman, yes, she tells about her experiences in Ravensbrück. However, Dina's fate, Monica, did not end with her throwing those sandwiches to the seagulls, because then she also arrived in Sweden, and arrival in Sweden was, of course, liberation, but it was a liberation not without ordeals. And I'm extremely happy that we also have Dr. Britta Geschwindt, hopefully here with us tonight from somewhere in the Swedish forest, right, Britta? But we have you here. Britta is a research coordinator at the Swedish Holocaust Museum, and she is joining us per link because she has researched exactly, this is one of her research fields, to talk about the reception in Sweden. So, Britta, I hope you can hear us. Good evening from Berlin to Sweden. We just heard, yes, you can. We can hear you. Just going to test the sound.
Yes.
Yes, you're here.
I hope you hear me.
Also, yes, we can hear you. Wonderful. We just heard about these women who have gone through hell and then suddenly find themselves in a country which has not experienced war. And I'm sure that there were, let's call it, cultural clashes or sometimes good intentions that turned out to be a little bit problematic. So can you tell us briefly about how these survivors were received in Sweden? I think you, when we spoke before, you mentioned something which I think was very telling. You said a Sweden that both wanted to help and control. Please, Britta.
Yes, thank you. I'm very pleased and happy to be here in this wonderful setting, and with thank you so much for your presentations. It was very interesting and moving. Yes, so the reception was aimed at both care and aid, but also control. And there's a lot of examples of empathy and friendship and respect between Swedish aid workers and the former prisoners. But there is also, sometimes you can see that there were also ignorance and an ability sometimes to understand. So there were indeed a lot of clashes. So there was intense fear that dangerous diseases from the concentration camps, such as diphtheria, typhus, cholera, and tuberculosis, would be brought into the country by the former prisoners. So for this reason, there were disinfection and delousing upon arrival, and repeatedly, these people underwent medical examinations. And that meant that you had to undress in front of men, male staff. You had to go into saunas, you had to shower, and these were very intimate meetings, very traumatic for many of these people. So there was indeed clashes between Swedish rationality and their experiences from the camps. And the authorities were also very concerned about venereal diseases. So women were subjected also to gynecological exams. And this really echoed experiences from Ravensbrück, where exams were regularly performed. And you could look at it as a form of sexual violence, actually, that these women repeatedly underwent. And then in Sweden, again, to be subjected to this, to help them, but also to protect the Swedish men. And also, their clothes were terrible. They were rags. They were infected with lice, and often these clothes had to be burnt. So the authorities took care of them and burnt them. They couldn't know, maybe, that these women, mainly they were mostly young women that came, but also they had hidden treasures, maybe for years in the camps. In the linings, there could be evidence of atrocities. There could be a friend keeping that friend by a token of something, of a memory. And these things were burnt. So there's a lot of letters of desperate people that are searching for their clothes. So many lost everything they had in this disaffection. And then they were sorted in different kinds of camps, and they were interviewed because checking out who were these people. So the seriously ill were separated from the healthier, of course, and they had to go through quarantine for a couple of weeks. And the quarantine was behind barbed wires and fences. And that goal was to prevent contact between the former prisoners and the local population, both to protect the former prisoners from the public's eyes, but also to protect the people around the camps from the diseases they could carry. And then they were moved to various refugee camps around the country. These range from very large barrack camps with up to 2,000 people to very, very small camps housing just a dozen or so. And borders and border crossings are always filled with ideological, moral, and existential meaning. So these zones are emotionally charged landscapes, you could say. And these medical border practices also serve to keep out and control unwanted behaviors. So the police also asked, do you know anyone else amongst these people that are dangerous or could be perceived as a threat in some way? Could there be a SS hiding, or should or also looking for sexual deviancy sometimes? So there were questions about the others. So they were sorted by health, they were sorted by gender, and they were sorted by nationality into various camps, and to some extent also Jews and non-Jews, but mostly Jews and non-Jews ended up in the same camps. So the hierarchies of the Nazi camps that Andrea was talking about lingered in Swedish reception camps. There were anti-Semitism among the prisoners. There were people that were highly educated, and there were workers, and there were a lot of misconceptions and also these hierarchies, sexual stigma, that in all these different groups, women were the lowest, and especially if others were talking about them as loose. So the reception was gendered. And also, there were also camps for the people that were unwanted. So I've been researching, for instance, a detention camp that was instigated in 1945 for women. And some women from Ravensbrück ended up there. So there were women there were perceived as ungrateful or causing trouble, viewed as promiscuous or deviant, but you could actually today understand that many of these women were suffering from PTSD. They were very logically responding to, for instance, a doctor medical fighting for their life to not be examined, for instance. So there was a lot of this terrible clashes.
So for you, you've been telling me, you described this very, I mean, basically having, I mean, we saw the different categories of prisoners. And for example, what you told me when we spoke previously was that you would have perhaps Jewish prisoners, and then you would have political prisoners who were very anti-Semitic together. You also mentioned one story about a very young girl who actually identified, if I understood you correctly, the capos, you know, the capos who were actually prisoners, but they were used as guards in the camp in the same continent where they came to Sweden. So you would have that. I would like to ask you just these, the plans were, I mean, for the non-Scandinavian refugees, that they would get fit enough to return, to be repatriated to their countries. What actually happened? Was that the case? Did some of them return, or did most of these prisoners who were non-Scandinavian actually stay in Sweden?
Yeah, correct. So the idea was that they would recover, they would get healthy, and they could go back to their countries, and they will help restore their countries and so forth. But of course, quite soon it was clear that, especially, for instance, the Polish, many people had nothing to go back to. And the state said, like, okay, so if you want to stay, the Polish, for instance, if you want to stay, you can stay. But that is not really the case, because it's not conditioned. So I've been looking at this conditioning, who was repatriated and anyhow. So, for instance, this woman that I mentioned, it was a 15-year-old girl who came from Ravensbrück. She was a political prisoner, and she recognized two women, a couple, but one of them a guard of Ravensbrück. And these two women were sent to this internment camp in the south of Sweden. But just shortly after, she herself was sent to the same camp, detention camp, because they had found several men in her bedroom in the refugee camp. And as you today can understand, this was not something she would have chosen, but she was the one that was condemned for this behavior and sent to that camp. So she was actually in the same detention camp as the two women she had recognized as couple and yeah.
So there were many
and she was deported. So she and these two other women were to be deported back to Poland with the same transport.
With the same transport, yes.
Yeah.
Britta, please stay with us. I want to also a little bit wrap up the discussion, so forth. But Monica, back to you. I want to ask you something, because you mentioned something in the beginning, and you've been telling me before that your mother, Dina, did tell you so many of these things. You grew up with these stories, these testimonies, and also I think the wider family and so forth. And this is a little bit unusual, because as you're aware, we very often hear about the stories of silence, of people having survived the worst atrocities, but being silent about them because they're too traumatic. So I want to ask you, why do you think that your mother told you all these stories?
I know why she told me and other people that wanted to listen. It's a story behind. Do you want me to tell it?
Please.
When she was in Birkenau, in block number 19, it was opposite block 25, the death block. In the death block, women were gathered that were deemed to be dead. In the daily selections, that were selected to die. But the capacity of the crematoriums were not enough, so they had to wait alive. So they were locked in this block 25 to wait for their death, to wait for the crematoriums to have more capacity. And one day, my mother heard someone called her from one of the windows in block 25. Dina, Dina, is that really you? And she recognized a schoolmate, Feiga. And Feiga said to her, Dina, I know what will happen to me. But if you survive, you must promise me that you will tell the world what they do to us. And my mother promised Feiga that she would tell the world what they did to these young innocent women and others. And she kept that promise all her life. This way.
She kept the promise, and
Yes,
now
she
you're
kept the
carrying on
promise.
with that torch. That's an amazing also story. Thank you for sharing that. And let us now also look forward a little bit, because we are in the country of Erinnerungskultur, of memory, of remembrance, of cultural of remembers. And I know that both Ingrid, you, and together with Monica, I think even in the same group, you do spend a lot of time visiting schools and telling. You tell about Dina's experiences, you tell about your research. This is, of course, something that you do on a daily basis in Ravensbrück, educating all the visitors and the groups, especially young people coming. And I wanted to start asking Ingrid, and Monica, you may add also why this is important for you. And also, we remember 25 years ago, the Prime Minister at that time, Göran Persson, he observed that the knowledge of Holocaust in Sweden, especially among young people, was very low, and therefore he initiated a very broad information campaign, which resulted in printing out a booklet that was distributed to all the school children. He also founded the Forum for Living History, and then also eventually IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, that you are probably familiar with. And it's 25 years down the road. So, and you've been working with these issues for a long time, and Monica also directly, indirectly. What observations do you do now when you meet these young people of today? Any specific comments on the knowledge and the interest in the Holocaust? Perhaps Ingrid, you can start.
We belong to the same group, Monica and I, and we usually go out together to schools, and I think the response is fantastic. You know, I tell my mother's story. She came to Sweden with a Kindertransport from Vienna to Sweden, and your mother survived the war, and so to give a personal testimony is such a great compliment to history teaching. And it's very appreciated, and we find it so rewarding to meet young people and to talk to them about their knowledge and how they understand history and the similarities and the differences between now and then. So we only had good experience, Monica, right? You and I. And we may meet with thousands of young people every year. So that's wonderful. And then you asked me about the status of the knowledge since Göran Persson launched this huge campaign. I would say that the improvement is enormous for the last 20 years. First of all, it's mandatory now in schools to study the Holocaust. That's one thing. The teachers are so much better prepared. There is a public interest, so you have films. As in Germany, you have films and exhibitions and theater plays and public talks and seminars all the time. And then you have two public agencies. You have the Living History Forum, which I used to be part of, and then you have the Holocaust Museum right now. So yes, there is a huge improvement in the knowledge of young people today. Yeah.
Would you like to add something, Monica, or why this is also important for you from a personal point of view?
It's important because it's an addition, as you say, to the history lessons. And the teachers appreciate it very much because they learn a lot about the World War II, but not how the war and the anti-Semitism affect civil society. the families, the individuals. And that is a dimension that we bring, the emotional dimension of what happened during the war. And hopefully it makes the student more aware of those things happening today, when people hate each other or go for each other in different ways.
I really
That's
want to
what
pick
we
up. I'm
hope
sure
for.
Andrea has something to
Not only to
add
tell
there.
us the history,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
to bring it to these days.
Yeah, please, Andrea.
Thank you for mentioning the second role as well, because we see also in our work in Ravensbrück that the second and third and fourth generation, coming the fifth generation, is so important for the work, and to understand why this topic is still so evident and so important in the different European countries. And we had now last Friday, we had an international forum in Ravensbrück, and we had to stop with 160 persons in the audience because it became too big, with families from former prisoners being together, speaking about their role, speaking about their position, speaking about mothers and fathers who didn't speak, who spoke, what's their own role. They were not a lot of them couldn't have a generation struggle with their parents like others. So it made something with them. And I think it's important to speak about these roles as well.
Because, I mean, I want to tag on that, because now we have this Bruchzeit. I mean, we have almost no first-generation survivors left. We just lost one, as the ambassador was saying last week, and Margot Friedlander. And on the other hand, I can't help also to mention that something that I found very interesting as a Swede here in Germany. I remember also when we talk about Erinnerungskultur, I mean the cultural remembrance, that, which is of course is very sophisticated in Germany for obvious reasons, but there are also sometimes very interesting outcomes. I think it was the EVZ Foundation that also connects these studies, the memo studies, regularly, where, for example, some of the results a couple of years ago showed that when young people in Germany are asked about the information, the perception of their family's role during the war, that a very, very high percentage, I don't know if it was a third or something, were very much convinced of that their family was involved in the resistance or in some kind of rescue operations, which of course has nothing to do with the reality, because we know, I mean, unfortunately, that the number was very minuscule. But a question to you about that, Andrea, what does that tell us? How come that this is the perception among so many young people?
Well, perhaps it's a result of our Erinnerungskultur, that we speak about the heroes in the war, the people who survived, and they want to be part of it. And it was the generations before who struggled with their parents, being part of the SS, being part of the Wehrmacht, being part of the German National Social Society. But young people nowadays have no contact anymore to people who, or almost no contact to people, to grandfathers, mothers who survived or who lived in the time of the Second World War. So they have a certain imagination of the picture. So what? Yeah.
And just to now, very soon to wrap up, and I will sure continue the discussions. I want to kind of throw out a last question for you, Andrea, also about the German Erinnerungskultur, which is a little bit of a Pandora's box, but I want you to take all these discussions upstairs also to the Ukrainian food, which has to do with, of course, once again, the period that we're in now, when the witnesses are not at least with us in first generation, and we also see a huge backlash in terms of both anti-Semitism, we see hatred, we see a lot of concerning polarization throughout the world. And we also have a changing society, I mean, both in Sweden, but definitely in Germany, more heterogeneous. Is there a need in Germany for a kind of Erinnerungskultur 2.0? Your thoughts on that?
Start from the very beginning. Yes and no. We have a certain history in dealing with the past and a certain knowledge, but every generation is struggling with this past. and have the right to struggle and to look for their own way to deal with the past. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think it's more, is it an Erinnerungskultur, or is it more really a dealing with the past? And what we need is information about the past in certain categories. So we need the knowledge of certain persons, but also some facts about the National Socialism.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to wrap up the panel. We're going to continue upstairs. I promised you some food and drinks, Ukrainian food and drinks. We're welcoming a person also who had to leave her country, Ukraine, Katya, who's now running a catering business here in Berlin. And of course, we would like to support her as much as we can to see the links. I mentioned the photo exhibition upstairs of or downstairs actually, of the white buses. But I'd like to just as a wrapping up, und ich mache das jetzt auch auf Deutsch, damit wir diesen Kreis auch mal ein bisschen schließen, weil ich möchte auch als Tochter eines Holocaust-Überlebenden, so ist es mir auch ein ganz persönliches Anliegen, im Rahmen nur ein paar abschließende Worte an Sie zu richten. Wir haben heute über die weißen Busse gesprochen, wir haben über die Schattenzeiten gesprochen, über Heldentaten, aber auch über unmögliche Dilemmas, über unvergessliche Befreiung, aber mit auch bitteren Elementen, über das komplexe Selbstbild einer Nation und ihre Geschichtsbeschreibung. Und wir haben auch in die Zukunft geblickt mit der Frage, wie geht es jetzt weiter? Und wie können wir weiter erinnern und wie können wir weiter lernen? Und wir wissen natürlich, dass die meisten von uns, die werden nie zu humanitären Ikonen werden, die Hunderttausende oder Tausende Menschenleben retten. Aber wir können alle das feste Versprechen abgeben, immer Menschen zu werden und niemals Menschen zu werden, die zuschauen. Wie ein Weißer einmal gesagt hat, für den Triumph des Bösen reicht es, wenn die Guten nichts tun. Seid Menschen, respektiert Menschen, was immer sie sind, hat die weise Margot Friedlander gesagt, weil ein Mensch kann etwas bewirken. Und wenn wir alle nach diesem Prinzip leben und handeln, dann können wir, glaube ich, Hass und Gleichgültigkeit entschlossen gemeinsam entgegentreten. Nie wieder ist jetzt und an jedem weiteren Tag. And with that, I would like to thank our fantastic panels here in Berlin, Monica Hartwig, Ericson, Dr. Andrea Genest, Associate Professor Ingrid Lomfors, and Dr. Britta Geschwindt. And a big thank to you, audience, who's been up here tonight. Some Ukrainian borscht and something to drink. Yes, okay.